The creative genius, the mad scientist, the tortured artist. The idea that highly creative people are often a bit crazy has been around for centuries, due in part to the mysterious driving power of the creative process.
It's something beyond us that speaks through us and that we don't always have a lot of control over. In fact, we almost never have control over that creative force.
The fine line between genius and insanity has been celebrated in classic literature and glamorized in popular films. Now, as scientific advances bring us closer to understanding the human brain, new research is revealing the possible links between a creative mind and a disturbed one.
There is some relationship between having mental illness and doing creative things. It's obviously not one-to-one. Not all people who are mentally ill are creative, but there are people who certainly have both.
Most people think being a creative genius means having a high IQ. But surprisingly, studies have shown no direct correlation between extremely creative people and high intelligence. Creative geniuses possess something even more intriguing: the ability to think differently from the crowd, to make novel combinations, think in opposites, and take chances.
Some people see things that others can't, and they're right, and we call them geniuses. Some people see things that others can't, and they're wrong, and we say they're mentally ill.
The notion of the mad creative genius dates back to ancient Greece, where Aristotle first observed that prominent men in politics, poetry, and the arts were prone to melancholia. Many of our most famous creative geniuses have been afflicted with a range of mental illnesses, including bipolar disorder, alcoholism, and anxiety. From renowned artists like Vincent van Gogh, Edvard Munch, and Jackson Pollock, to writers like Virginia Woolf, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Edgar Allan Poe. Even some of our most creative scientific geniuses, such as Sir Isaac Newton, suffered from schizophrenia and depression.
Newton had a psychotic break and spent most of his life being as paranoid as you could possibly be.
Madness is where it gets scary for us. And I think that's what's haunting about the creative genius, is you never quite know, are they going to build an atomic bomb? Or are they going to do something destructive like Frankenstein? And I think that's the ambivalent feelings we have about the creative genius. We kind of give them a lot of space and are drawn to them, but also a little scared of them.
Over the last decade, a large number of studies support the commonly accepted link between creativity and mental illness. Although it's unclear exactly where in the brain that connection exists. Neuroscientists have found that people who suffer from depression or bipolar disorder, or the delusional thought patterns of schizophrenia, tend to exhibit unusual activity in the frontal lobe of the brain, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. Hyperactivity in this region may free the brain to draw unusual connections between seemingly unrelated items or ideas. It may also produce a burst of creativity, especially in the bipolar personality.
Certainly, a lot of creative people tend to look bipolar. They tend to be hypomanic. They tend to stay up all night and paint. The hypomanic energy can be very useful if you can harness it. And that's one of the reasons hypomanic people or bipolar people don't like to be medicated. They don't have the lows, but they also don't have the highs. But most bipolar people are kind of willing to pay that price.
New research is also turning up a potential link between dopamine and creativity, and may support the long-held belief that creatives might be prone to madness. Researchers at Sweden's Karolinska Institute compared the brain activity of highly creative people to that of schizophrenics, specifically in an area called the thalamus. Dopamine receptors in the thalamus help to filter incoming sensory information. The researchers discovered that both groups had fewer dopamine receptors in the thalamus than most healthy adults. Fewer receptors may mean less filtering and could lead to what's known as divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is an important aspect of creative thinking. It allows some people to come up with many different possible solutions to a problem or question. To measure divergent thinking and test creativity, psychologists use the alternative uses test. Subjects are asked to list various ways to use common objects, such as a brick or paperclip. More uses means more divergent thought and a more creative mind. In creative people, divergent thought often leads to innovation. But in schizophrenic patients, it's responsible for the illogical and confused thinking that characterizes the disorder.
People who are creative are also kind of out there at the edge of the universe, potentially about to drop off and pulling themselves back. And if that's where you are, well, you could drop off. That tendency to be exploratory can get you into trouble.
Another potential link may be found in the twisted strands of our DNA. Scientists in Iceland analyzed the medical and genetic data of 86,000 Icelanders. They found that people in creative professions were 17% more likely to have genetic variations that raised their risk of developing mental disorders. The findings support the idea that our genes have a direct influence on our creativity and our tendency toward mental illness.
Mental illness often runs in families. Creativity often runs in families. And there are families in which both creativity and mental illness run together. You know, Einstein himself didn't have clear schizophrenia, but he was peculiar. You know, kind of, we might say schizotypal, just an odd man, and he had a son with schizophrenia. Look at a family like the Vonnegut's, where Kurt had a father who was creative, a brother who was creative, a son who was somewhat creative and was mentally ill. Kurt was mentally ill. All three of his children have a mental illness of some sort. Think about Hemingway, who, you know, his father committed suicide using a shotgun. Hemingway committed suicide using exactly the same shotgun that his father used. So that's an example of the tendency of mental illness to run in the family, and the Hemingway family is just full of mental illness.
But genes don't define a personality. Not everyone with genetic predispositions to mental illness will experience depression or delusions. Other factors, such as early life experiences, trauma and stress, even viral infections, can play a role.
And the depressive mother will teach a child that life is very sad and very hard and overwhelming, and that child's more likely to grow up depressed. So how much of that is genetics and how much of it's environmental and how much of it's learning from our parents, we haven't sorted out yet.
Despite the new science, there's still no conclusive proof that creatives suffer more from mental illness than the general population. It could be that celebrities who have mental illness draw much more public attention than the average Joe.
So we look at our artists more intensely, and when we look at anyone intensely, we find their craziness, because we've all got some. Nobody gets out of this okay.
Perhaps the very definition of crazy is what perpetuates the idea that creativity and madness go hand in hand. Many creatives are simply more eccentric. They march to a different beat, exhibiting behavior that's less accepted by the mainstream.
We tend to, I think, excessively medicate people and not appreciate how hard life is and how people struggle, and the dark night of the soul can be very productive, and you don't always have to medicate it or shock it or even talk it through.
As science continues to explore the link between creativity and madness, what we learn may surprise us. Thinking outside the box could be tied to mental instability, but it might also prove to be one of mankind's greatest assets.